This project, I think, probably came out of the earlier work that I was doing on Chinese migrants in the Cold War. And one of the things, and thank you, Carl, for referencing that and for hosting us today. One of the things that was really striking in looking at the experience of refugees in Asia and the ways in which they, in some ways, got stuck because very few countries were willing to open their doors to refugees from communism if they were in Asia until the 1970s. But one of the ways in which their cases and their situations were made known was that church groups and transnational church organizations were so active on their behalf. So the Lutheran World Council, the World Council of Churches. And so it was in doing that early work that I became really interested in the role of religious groups and organizations in the activism that was being undertaken on behalf of refugees. And so those were the early maybe seeds for this project. I think one of the reasons I'm so excited about talking about this project today is that it's been such a long time coming. I've been working on this book for 8 years, which I'm told is not too long for a second book, but it feels really, really long. And part of the reason it took a long time was the global pandemic, which really interrupted the kind of work that could be done. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But essentially, when I started thinking about the kinds of activism that I saw in the context of the Cold War, I turned my attention to thinking about the sanctuary movement in the 1980s and the role of churches in staking out claims to the right to protect migrants from deportation or to protect the right to asylum and to facilitate people's movement through those systems. So that was the connection point. And as it turned out, Montreal, which is the focus of the book, and notice it's not in the title. I describe it as a North American city because I'm quite determined to think about histories of sanctuary and movement as entangled, and what happens in the United States, in Europe, and Canada gets cross-referenced across the decades. And so it was really important to me to look at a particular city, but think about all the ways in which the histories of sanctuary in a particular place are entangled with these broader connections, these broader forces. And so partly as a result of geography, I decided that I would look at Montreal specifically. And that had also a lot to do with the fact that Montreal declared itself a sanctuary city in 2017. So this was a little bit later than some of the sanctuary city movement in the United States, but there have been a number of cities in Europe and in Canada who followed that early initiative. And Montreal declared itself a sanctuary city and didn't quite expect what the Trump administration did the first time around. And so all of a sudden, there actually was significant demand at the Canada-US border for refuge. And this created all kinds of pressures, and the discourse changed very, very quickly around protection for refugees and migrants. And Montreal walked back its sanctuary city declaration very, very quickly. So by 2019, it was saying we can't be a sanctuary city, we're just going to be a responsible city. And I found that flip-flop very interesting. And at that point, I'd already started thinking about, well, what does it actually mean for a city to offer sanctuary? So Sergio's contributions, I think, are to a slightly different literature. Mine are very much, my contributions are very much focused on urban studies, urban histories, and the significance of place. And they're also focused on much of the scholarship in refugee studies, which continues to struggle with what happens beyond refuge. And so these were the two animating questions for the book, was really to think about what does sanctuary look like in a particular place? How has that evolved historically? But most importantly, what does it look like beyond the state? The city, proved rather unreliable in terms of its declaration of sanctuary. And so this made me really want to interrogate sanctuary at a community level. And because refugee studies, I think, really does need to pay attention to what happens beyond asylum, beyond refuge, that became another important part of the project as well. So essentially, Sanctuary in Pieces is a deep dive. It's 200 years of sanctuary cases in Montreal. I ended up looking at 6 different cases, and I can talk more in the Q&A maybe about the mixed methodologies, let's say, that went into selecting those cases. And what I really wanted to underscore and think through was in some ways the precarity of sanctuary and refuge, that you can make a declaration, that you can be activists on behalf of an individual or a community or a cause, and yet sanctuary remains precarious, it remains fragile. And I think this is a real point of intersection with some of the things that Sergio was talking about. So I was very inspired by Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities. And so each of the chapters in the book is dedicated to a different case study, and it's each case study evolves around a particular theme. So I'll just go through the case studies very quickly, and then I'll just talk a little bit about some of the broad structuring points in the book. The first case study is called The Lonely City, and it's about the experience of fugitive slaves and the lack of refuge that they found in Montreal, which is surprising. It goes counter to the very strong narrative about, the Underground Railroad and the Northern Star. But the reality is that Montreal was not a hospitable place for fugitive slaves. And so that opens the book. And then I move to what I call the fugitive city, which interrogates the question of fugitivity and the way that we've been using it in recent years. And it returns to an older definition of fugitivity. And in this case, it's a wanted criminal. It's John Surratt, who is suspected in the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And I've had a number of people say to me that this particular case probably shouldn't be in the book because he's not a very nice character. And I actually think it is precisely for that reason that it should be in the book, right? That sanctuary is constantly evolving, and who we think is worthy and meritorious of sanctuary and protection has actually changed quite dramatically over the years. So John Surratt stayed despite some pushback. And then I moved to looking at the experiences of Emma Goldman, who was exiled from the United States in 1919 and spent the rest of her anarchist career very much wanting to get back to the United States and not able to do so for any extended period of time. But she spends a lot of time in Canada, in Montreal and Toronto, because they are close to the United States. And she's so desperately miserable in her time in the city. She's lonely. She doesn't have any sympathy for the French Canadian cause. She doesn't think the revolution is going to happen in Canada. And so it's a chapter that reflects very much on the experience and significance of exile. And the last three chapters are much more contemporary. They look at what I call the wartime city, which was the experiences of war resistors who moved to Canada during the American War in Vietnam, but who encountered the FLQ crisis in Montreal, which was a moment of nationalist, anti-colonial resistance, and looks at the expectations and experiences that they had in the city. And some of them did get caught up in the arrests that were undertaken under the War Measures Act. And the last two chapters are very contemporary, much more akin to, I think, work that's been done on sanctuary cities and church sanctuary. So they look at the occupation of churches in the 1990s by Chilean refugees who are facing deportation. And the last chapter looks at sanctuary in the early 2000s. And for each of the chapters, I spent a lot of time. Well, I actually kept a journal because I was doing this in the pandemic and I couldn't talk to people. I missed going to conferences. And so I just journaled to myself. And I decided that I would incorporate those, what I call notes from the field, into the book so that the whole process of researching and writing this project, because it took so much time, would be very, very transparent. And it let me raise ethical questions about whose stories get told and how and under what conditions. And the last thing I'll say in terms of maybe the broad structuring dimensions of this project is that it was really important to me to frame this entire research within the context of migration and forced displacement in an evolving settler colonial project. So I use, wherever possible, Indigenous names for cities. So Montreal being Tiohtià in Mohawk, or Mooniyaang and Anishinaabemowin. It was really, I think, it wasn't a dramatic gesture, but it was really important to me to flag that as a focal point and a way that we can think about questions of sanctuary and refuge, but really against these broader backdrops of what it means to, in the case of Montreal, seeking sanctuary on unceded territory and traditional territories. So that was a really key intervention that I wanted to weave throughout the book. And I think the last thing is just really to reflect on the craft of history in difficult times. We were talking before the official recording started about we're not just living in interesting times, we're living in difficult times, and the role of history and the stories that we tell about the possibility of sanctuary and refuge, in that context. And for me, it was really important throughout the book to underscore how sanctuary and refuge, regardless of the formal dimensions, whether it be in a church or offered by the state, that ultimately it's been forged by migrants and individuals themselves. And the ways in which we see that those community efforts are not always obvious, but really important to highlight.